We're pleased to welcome child and adolescent family therapist Darby Fox. Welcome, Darby, and thanks for coming on to talk about co-parenting.
Thanks for having me.
The first question I'd love to ask you is, how does co-parenting, because we hear a lot about the conscious uncoupling, we hear a lot of kumbaya in the media and other places about how wonderful it can be when two people get together and make a conscious decision to have a seamless transition. But Darby, when it comes to especially folks in our community, there's emotion, there's feeling, people are hurt. At least one party specifically hurt more than the other as a result of the breakup. And when they have children together, it's tough to keep those emotions out of the equation, to which you would say what?
It is very hard to keep the emotions out of the equation, even when it's been a long time. It's hard to not remember when there's interaction, a piece of you that used to be in a struggle with that person. It's inevitable when you have kids. So I think it takes a long time, and it's always conscious that you have to think about, okay, who's this about? It's about the children and what's actually best for the children. And you have to keep bringing it back to that. And it's hard to always be thinking about that, especially several years down the road.
What can you say to a parent who has sort of this emotional upheaval going on inside of them, where they can't just simply plan the logistics, where truly the emotion still gets the better of them? And in order to bring that point home that you just made very articulately about what's best for the children, how do you work with a parent to get them above that hump?
It can be very difficult, especially if there's one parent who is always willing to bring it back to some form of hostility or bringing up the past. But I think one simple tip that I use often, if people can keep in mind that instead of it being about marriage or divorce, if they can think of it more as a business deal. So what they're trying to accomplish, if they can withdraw the personal emotion and think, okay, what's my objective? We just have to get them from point A to point B, and I'm not going to try and react, because often the ex-spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever it may be, will try and draw you in emotionally. And it's really important to keep in mind, act like it's a business deal. Just don't let yourself draw in when they're pulling at your emotions.
What do you do when there's still feelings for the other person, especially when the other person may have, the ex-partner now has someone in their lives?
That's tricky. And one way to do that is to try and find a way to distance yourself. It's kind of hard. Kids often will think, oh, just come in and pick me up at dad's, or, oh, I'll be at mom's, stop by. But especially if it's gotten more complicated and you're still longing for that person, it's better to try and set up a little protection for yourself in advance. And the protection comes through saying, you know what, I'm going to just meet you in the driveway. You'll need to come out. I'll text you. Or I'm just going to talk with your dad through email or text, and protect yourself a little bit. Sometimes kids really sense if there is some sort of hostility, and they don't like that. That's very hard for them, even adult kids. So they'll try and push you in a different direction, but it's really important that you try and keep in your comfort zone, and creating a little distance is the best way to do that.
Okay, because in part two, Darby, there is this maybe sense of even further isolation, because you can't really oftentimes have this conversation. You can't really talk to your kids about what's going on inside you emotionally. So you almost keep it from them too, the fact that you're hurting around. You can't really say, well, it hurts me to be around your dad or your mom, or I don't like their new partner, right?
You're right about that. You don't need to go into details, but the part that I disagree with is it's very important that you say to your child, you know what, this is kind of hard for me. And you don't need to go much further than that. Other than a very young child, they should be able to pick up on that. And you do need to say that, because you're modeling to them a healthy way to handle your emotions. And instead of just pretending it doesn't exist or pushing through, it's much better to show them, you know what, this is kind of hard for me. So help me out here. Come on out to the driveway at 6:15 or whatever that may be. And that is much healthier. And the kids actually feel a little better because then they can respond to you. We often try to put them at a place where we don't want to involve them in any of that. But in reality, they pick up on it. They can see it and feel it. And then it's awkward.
We're in the year 2017, Darby, so this is not the 1950s where the norm is that everyone's married and has a family and, the Leave It to Beaver universe. Clearly things have changed, and there are a lot of single-parent families around, a lot of divorced families around. So in a sense, we do have a new normal, right? I mean, on some level, this isn't that abnormal to be in a situation where your natural parents don't live together.
It's not that abnormal anymore. And the one thing that we can do to normalize it, regardless of the situation, is to try and eliminate the hostility and the anger. And that's very hard to do, especially if you're still somehow attached to the other partner, or you really disapprove of how they handle themselves or your child. But the biggest key we do know now with all kinds of research that we didn't used to, we used to just think if families were divorced, then it was just catastrophic for the kids. We know now that that's absolutely not true. And if anything, the children, when they can see how to handle conflict and they can get through it and pick up, and they become much more resilient. And it is a new normal now. So I think that is something to keep in mind. It is very common, and the thing that makes it okay is that we can interact without the hostility.
What do you do, Darby, when questions come from the children? When they want to know, they have questions, when they want to know what's wrong, why is this hurtful for you? Why isn't this handoff? Why doesn't it feel seamless? And they sense that there's, like you said, they're good at sensing things, and they may have questions. They may want to get into detail, especially as the kids get older. How do you position your clients to deal with inquisitive kids?
Again, the best thing you can do is I want them to be honest. I want them to answer honestly. But when I say that, we want to be age appropriate. So you only give them the amount of information that a child at a certain age can understand. And you don't ever need to go into the actual details of the relationship, but especially if you've got teenage kids, it's, again, really important to say to them, you know what, it's difficult for me to see your dad with another woman. It's hard for me. I still, we're not together and it didn't work for us, but I still have feelings, or whatever it may be. I'm disappointed that it seems like your dad always gets to do the fun things with you. And that's kind of hard for me. I know that's not really the way it is, but that's how I feel. And it's important that, again, you express to them, I know it should be this way, but I'm feeling a little uncomfortable, or I feel sad or angry. Again, that's what we need to tell the kids, is it's not so easy. And then when they come up with those things, they know how to deal with them. They often have their own feelings about the relationship.
Now, when we don't handle the co-parenting correctly, and by correctly, maybe I am talking about an environment where it feels like there's a rhyme and reason to how things are done, right? And that it does follow some strategic and logistical planning reason behind things. What are the benefits, and then what happens that is disadvantageous to the children if you do it, if things go awry? So can you talk about both sides of that equation?
Right. The conscious, uncoupling, that term, it's great in theory, but there is every couple that's split like that is sharing a child that at some point will become undone. There's something that won't work so well, because what we have to keep in mind is you're no longer together because you couldn't get along. So given that, I think it's really important to understand where are your limits. It's a new relationship, and as if it were another person involved that was romantic, a kid really isn't that much different. We have to try and pull back and remember, okay, it's not how I want it done, but that's why I'm not with them anymore. What can I do about it? You know what? I'm going to let this battle go. It's not really worth it. And often what we see is one person or the other constantly wanting to control and run things, especially when the child is with one parent or the other. And that's a very negative chemistry. It's hard for either parent to move on, and the kids then pick up on the tension. So with that, I think I really encourage parents to try and pull back, and unless something's really going awry, then you let them go. I mean, the food may not be the same at dad's. It may be all takeout. You just got to let some of that stuff go, as long as there's loving, caring, and, reasonable boundaries set. So I think that's one of the, things that we have to really keep in mind that can be a negative of the co-parenting is, where do we let go? And the other piece is, again, if we're doing it well, it's great to show, again, what you have to remember, what's our goal here? Our goal here is to raise children to become responsible adults. So what we want to try and do is, even if we're not getting our way, we want to show them we can compromise, we can give, and we can move forward, that we can find a common ground over one shared piece. And that's goes, I can't even tell you how important that is for your children to see as a life lesson of how they go forward. Like, what happens when conflict comes into my life? How do I deal with it? And that's the biggest upside, is to see two people who no longer are supposedly loving each other, living in the same place, still able to come together and work through something. You have to do that every day in business, bosses, whatever. So it's the best example.
We're talking to Darby Fox. He's a child and adolescent family therapist. And the website, Darby, for anyone who wants to check you out and potentially reach out for the opportunity to work with you, would be?
darbyfox.com.
And Darby Fox is DARBYFOX, which you will see on the bottom of your screen. Let's talk about an overarching theme or pillar of thought. In order to make this work, as wounded as we may be as a parents going through this, isn't it fair to say that we've got to put the kids ahead of ourselves, that there's got to be some sense at least of being unselfish, at least as far as the children are concerned?
That's what we hope for. That's exactly what we hope for, is that the parents can take that stance and say, okay, you know what, I'm going to put the kids first and go for this and try and make it work. What happens, and it's just like with other breakups, if there's an emotional component, it's sometimes hard to always be selfless and put someone else first. So I think a good thing to think about with that, good advice to give, is when you start to feel that knot in your stomach or the racing heart or the shoulders go up when you're dealing with an ex, it's important to think about not, okay, they're wrong or right, I'm gonna get my way here, but think about, okay, what's triggering this? What is that person, my ex, actually doing that is triggering my discomfort? And that's the piece that we want you to work on, so that you can actually move forward and start to let it go and not get involved again in the other person like you used to as a lover, but to try and pull yourself back and say, you know what, they used to do that to me. I'm not going to let it go there. This is about the kids. And that's a hard thing to do, but use the discomfort to signal to you, okay, this is why I'm not there anymore. I'm going to pull back and I'm going to really put the kids up front.
And we get challenged often. We get challenged when our children have conversations with our partners or the partner's new either family members or new partner, our ex-partner's new partner, that is, where information gets to our children that is injurious to us in some way, or they speak negatively about us, if they can't hold it in and somehow it gets back to us, the parent.
Right.
What's your take on that situation, and how do you see to resolve that?
Again, that is so damaging beyond what we think it would be. You kind of expect it from an ex, parent, but when the third party in the mix sends those kind of messages, what I really encourage them to think about is they're not hurting the ex-spouse or whatever that relationship is, as nearly as much as they're hurting the child. Because the child, you got to remember, is part of each person. The mom, the dad, the partners, whatever the combination, the child sees themselves as part of those two mixtures. So if you are injuring them or putting a backhanded comment about the old wife or whatever that may be, you're actually cutting down the child to their face. That's how it's perceived. And the damage there is great. And I think that if people could understand that piece, they're not really hurting the other person near as much as they're hurting the child. Hopefully we could prevent that.
And it should be incumbent upon the ex to probably lay down the law, right? And actually have a conversation with the new partner and say, look, no matter what your thoughts are, I don't want you speaking badly about my ex in front of my children.
It should be a standard practice. I mean, that should almost go without saying, but there are probably cases where it has to be said just like that. It's just so important to keep it away from the children. And that's a teenager or a very young child.
Now, since you deal with children and adolescents, you probably see some of the consequences of relationships among their parents that don't go the way that we would hope and do have psychological and lasting impact on the children. How do you handle that with children who are growing out of this dysfunction?
That's difficult, but again, what I hope to do there is a little bit of as what I've described for a hurting ex person, for lack of a better term. With the child, we want to try and look at what feels damaging and pull them away from where they feel it so personally and look more objectively, like, that's how your dad acts. This is who your dad is. He does love you, but these are the kind of patterns that your dad has in his life. Or this is how your mom reacts to stress. And what's helpful about that is we have to remember, and I really like to teach, especially adolescents, that we can't control what other people do, even our parents, but what we can do is control how we react to them. So it's really important that that's what we work on instead of trying to get the kid to encourage them to act differently. Again, hopefully that comes about through some distancing. Does that make sense?
Sure. And I wonder, in all of the work that you do with clients who are in this dynamic, what do you think is the single or maybe top 2 or 3 things that we do that are the telltale signs of a good relationship and a good proactive, not only coexistence with respect to co-parenting, but also good harbingers of creating functional and adaptive children who really grow from the experience?
Well, I mean, the top thing to do is to leave that piece of the anger and dislike, even when it goes that far, of the ex out of a public arena. And by that, I mean, if you have to be at the soccer field or the lacrosse field or a music recital with the other person, I really can't encourage you enough to be pleasant, be cordial. You don't have to be fake, but to be cordial and be able to be in the same room and engage other people is probably the most helpful thing for the kids. And it's actually very healing once you can walk away from a situation and be like, oh, you know what? It wasn't that bad. I can actually co-parent with this person. I can coexist with them. And what it does is it puts everybody at ease. You'll often find in really a contentious divorced couple, no one wants to be around them. The kids don't, other people don't. No one wants to hear about that tension. So the biggest thing is to be able to, when you're in public or in joint situations, be able to really just be there and enjoy the situation without bringing that personal piece in.
And what's the key, Darby, to good communication between co-parents? What's the key that allows two people who didn't agree on their own relationship together and saw to it that the right thing to do was to split up? What is the key to being able to communicate where they're both satisfied with how the children are raised, how the logistics are conducted, and also just general well-being as they manage this process until a child is old enough?
One important thing to do, and it might sound sort of silly, but it can't be overstated enough. When you've split and you're actively co-parenting in separate houses or however it happens, it's a great idea to take a few minutes and each of you list, possibly definitely separately, but then bring it back together. What are my top priorities? Like, what do I really want to do for my children, and how do I see them, and what's my top priority? Is it homework? We need to find the areas we agree on and the areas we don't agree on. So school is our priority, off the internet by 10, no sleepovers after age 15, whatever it may be. It's important that the parents have that conversation in advance so they know that they're both kind of working towards the same goals. And if you don't have that conversation or write it down, then we always kind of assume. And often the lack of communication is what ends up becoming too much for couples, and that's where they split. So we really need to think about this as a time to do it a little differently, and actually go as far as to say, okay, where are we, and what are our joint priorities?
Do you have faith that people who can't be together and have to raise a child from two different places with possibly new families in the mix, do you have faith that we all have the ability to do this and do this right as long as we stay committed and put our children first?
I absolutely do. I think the key piece there, you said before, is to be a little selfless, to think about the priority is the children, put them first. That doesn't mean do everything for them, but that means put their needs of not having the hostility and having a lot of communication first. If we can do that, regardless of any pain or anger that we have from the past, we can absolutely do it. Complete faith.
And as far as the toxicity in some relationships that goes well beyond the breakup and does somehow seep into the lives of the children, can they actually sit down as a family with a therapist, and even though they're not together, still work with the therapist to try and figure out how to make it work?
Yes, they can. I will say, I'll backtrack a little there. It's often hard to bring a family there that's no longer living together, a couple that's no longer together with their child, and bring them into therapy to kind of come to a joint communication. You can do it really successfully over certain issues, such as alcohol or drug abuse or things like that. But in general, you don't really see families wanting to, the exes don't really want to join in a therapy group like that. But that doesn't mean that we want to leave out the difficult topics, but you may want to do it separately. Like the dad may want to do it with the children and the mom, because again, we don't need to bring the emotional baggage of the couple into the situation, and it's kind of hard to keep that out if we're all pulling into the joint situation.
Are there any recommendations that you have for how to treat the situations that involve boys versus girls or adolescents versus little children, age disparities, et cetera? I mean, can you talk a little bit about gender and age and where a child is, maybe also in terms of where they are as far as like school age goes? I mean, just sort of general thoughts.
Yeah, the younger, it depends on what age the divorce comes about, how easy it is for children to accept it. There are certain ages where it's more difficult, certainly, and it's always a case by case situation. But really, young children seem to adjust quicker. It's hard for them because they're more about the physical missing the piece of the other person, but it's not as difficult when they get more into an age where they really understand, where they're at age 7 through 12, they understand something completely differently. And at that stage, they feel like they're absolutely partly the cause. And so that's an age group that we really want to focus on. And it's not, it doesn't go down a gender line as far as a boy or a girl. It's more of an age group there where they're real concrete thinkers. So they really think in the moment, and they're not able to think beyond, oh, well, it wasn't, that's how he acts historically. They don't think like that. So it's really important that we let them understand it is not about them and that they are not the cause. And when we get into adolescence, gets a little trickier because there tends to be usually a side that you line up on. And again, it's not necessarily a boy-girl thing. There are, different ways to interact with each relationship. I think if you're a dad and you've got an adolescent daughter and you've just been separated, what I would really encourage you to do is spend one-on time. Find some way, even if they're little things, that you can do to keep a one-on-one relationship with your daughter. And frequently, that is one combination that's very hard when we get into divorce, to see them able to do it where the daughter doesn't become the caretaker, where she doesn't fill the role of the wife. And I want to caution people to really keep the daughter still as a daughter, not as kind of an elevated wife, getting the meals, helping with that kind of thing. That's a super important adjustment. And by the same token.
Oh, go ahead. By the same token, no, you were going to say, go ahead.
If we're reversing it so that we want then the boy and the mother, because it's harder to keep those connections in adolescence in any parenting situation, together or not together, when we have the mixed genders, or cross gender. And that's where I think it's really important that you make an extra effort with a divorce to find a way to connect. Is it, well, I'll use a personal example. For me, it's easier to go get your nails done with your teenage daughter than it is to think, what am I going to do with my teenage boy that's of an equivalent nature? So you've got to figure out, is that watch a sports game? Is that listen to their music? What is it that I can do with them that will give them that one-on-one time? And I really think that is critical for adolescents that have gone through a divorce.
It does seem, as you're speaking, that gender does sort of make maybe not necessarily a difference in how much you love your children or care for them, but there are maybe different ways and strategies in how you raise them in the context of a co-parenting situation as they get older, adolescent girls and adolescent boys, and sort of how you shape the relationship.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it does matter. Again, you have to remember, what is my goal in raising kids? And often people think their goal is to just teach them not to be in trouble or to control them, especially through adolescence. You just want to control them and hope you get through it. But actually what you really want to do is have a relationship with these people, that so as they get to a stage where they're living their own lives, they have an example of how to act and how to be in a relationship. So that's the really important example. And you do want to make sure, whether it's a mother and a daughter or a mother and her son, that you actually talk about that and address that through adolescence.
And it's something that both parents probably have to address at some point in their conversations with one another.
Exactly. And frequently I have several cases where one upside of the divorce is the parents, if parents are working together, frequently, especially through the crazy years where there's all kinds of crazy sports schedules and music rehearsal, all different kinds of things going on, it's more about logistics than it is communication. And so what we see is that becomes much more difficult when you are single. Regardless of what your custody arrangement is, you're now all of a sudden providing all that on your own. And that's difficult. So it does elevate your children to a position of, you can either include them and have them understand the change in dynamics and how they need to help you and be a part of it, or it can become just overwhelming and really detrimental because everything's too chaotic and you feel sorry for them, so you never really ask anything of them. And so obviously I would fall on the side of encouraging the single parent, when they are in a single situation, to really ask your kids to be a part of what is happening in the daily life and ask them to participate and help out. And again, that just teaches them maturity and responsibility.
And final question, which is an echo of something we talked about earlier, but just to save the best for last here, so to speak.
Okay.
When we're still in love with an ex, when we still have very strong feelings for an ex, when we wish that the breakup never happened, and on some level, there are some parents out there who use the children, maybe even unwittingly, as a way to try and sort of angle some conversation or maneuver it around their ex in a certain way to have contact with them. And that can get very tricky. It's difficult to sort of get over those feelings that we have for someone that we shared a home with and love dearly. What say you about dealing with those kinds of feelings of still having very strong feelings for your ex, still being in love, and yet having to deal with this new reality?
Someone that is in that position, I really encourage to seek some professional help, some outside help, and some support groups, exactly like Exaholics, to help them really work through what is the piece they're holding on to, what can't they seem to move beyond, because it's very detrimental not only to the child but to that person if they can't move on and they're manipulating. And once we start to try and manipulate the relationships, we're no longer acting in an authentic way, and it can get really complicated. And that's something you never want to put a child, even an adolescent, into an adult situation or into a situation where they can't control what we're expecting from them. So the manipulation piece is very tricky. I'll give your dad a call, or let me just do this for your dad, send that over, whatever it may be, is really something that is not good. And if you find yourself in a position where you're really longing for the other person and you can't move on, you really need to get some professional help.
And if I'm hearing you right, the most difficult aspect of all of this for a child, or a child even growing up and even in adolescence, is not having any feeling or sense of control over the situation, that this is something that can get out of hand and there's not much you can, you're powerless to do anything about.
Right. For the kid at any stage, to feel tension and know that they have no control over it is very upsetting. That hopeless feeling is hard to get over or to deal with. And we will see them turn in a direction that's probably not healthy, whether it's they'll just want to withdraw completely and just hang out with peers, or they won't want to engage at all socially, or they'll start to use drugs or alcohol more frequently, or they'll be more promiscuous. We're not sure how it'll come out exactly, but we are sure that it will come out in a negative way. And so that's a really important piece that we need to keep in mind.
These were the words, the very wise words of Darby Fox.